Picture this. It's 1933, and a failed artist with a peculiar mustache stands before a microphone in Munich. The crowd hangs on his every word, mesmerized by his certainty, his unwavering conviction that he alone understands the path to greatness. There's something magnetic about him. Not his appearance, not his background, but something deeper. Something that would soon consume an entire nation and plunge the world into darkness. What was it that made millions follow a man who, by all objective measures, was unremarkable? What psychological force could transform ordinary citizens into willing participants in history's greatest horrors? And, most disturbing of all, what if that same force is not only still among us today but growing stronger? Across the Atlantic, in a quiet study in Switzerland, one man was watching. Carl Gustav Jung, the pioneering psychologist who had spent decades mapping the darkest territories of the human mind, recognized something terrifying in the unfolding drama. It wasn't madness he was witnessing. It was something far more dangerous because it appeared so rational, so compelling, so utterly convinced of its own righteousness. Jung had discovered what he would later call humanity's most dangerous psychological trait. Not psychopathy, not sociopathy, not even mental illness as we typically understand it. This was something that could exist in your neighbor, your colleague, your leader, even, Jung warned with characteristic honesty, in yourself. This trait doesn't announce itself with obvious warning signs. It doesn't come with a diagnosis or a clear label. Instead, it wears the mask of confidence, of vision, of someone who has finally figured it all out. It speaks with authority about complex issues, never pausing to consider that it might be wrong. It attracts followers not through force, but through the intoxicating promise of certainty in an uncertain world. Jung's research revealed that this psychological pattern had appeared throughout history, always with the same devastating results. From the witch trials of Salem to the gulags of Stalin, from the boardrooms of Enron to the echo chambers of social media, the same dangerous trait, manifesting across centuries and cultures, leaving destruction in its wake. However, what makes Jung's discovery so urgent for our time is that this trait is not randomly distributed. It's not a rare aberration that appears once in a generation. Jung observed that certain societal conditions that resemble our current moment, remarkably, create the perfect breeding ground for this psychological pattern to emerge and spread like a virus through the collective consciousness. The question that haunted Jung for the rest of his life, the question that should keep us awake at night, is this: how do we recognize this trait before it's too late? How do we protect ourselves from those who possess it? And more importantly, how do we ensure we don't become possessed by it ourselves? By the end of this exploration, you'll understand exactly what Jung discovered in the depths of the human psyche. You'll learn to recognize the warning signs that he mapped with scientific precision. And you'll discover why Jung believed that our survival as a species might depend on our ability to spot this dangerous trait before it takes hold. But first, we need to understand the man who made this discovery, and why his insights into human evil remain more relevant today than ever before. Carl Jung was not your typical academic psychologist, safely theorizing from an ivory tower. He was what we might call a shadow doctor, a man who made his career diving into the darkest recesses of the human mind, emerging with insights that would make most people profoundly uncomfortable. His patients weren't just dealing with everyday neuroses. They were individuals whose minds had been shattered by trauma, possessed by delusions, or consumed by what Jung termed autonomous complexes that seemed to operate independently of conscious will. Jung's clinic in Küsnacht became a kind of laboratory for studying human evil in its purest forms. He worked with patients who believed they were Napoleon, others who heard voices commanding them to violence, and those whose personalities seemed to fragment into multiple conflicting selves. But what disturbed Jung most wasn't the obvious pathology. It was the moments when his most dangerous patients appeared completely lucid, rational and utterly convinced of their own moral superiority. Unlike his mentor Freud, who focused on sexual repression, Jung became obsessed with what he called the shadow, the hidden, rejected aspects of personality that people refused to acknowledge in themselves. He discovered that the most dangerous individuals weren't those who acknowledged their darkness, but those who had completely disowned it. projecting all their evil onto the external world while maintaining an image of perfect righteousness. This insight took on terrifying relevance when Jung witnessed the rise of Nazi Germany. He wasn't just observing from a distance. He was analyzing the psychological mechanisms of propaganda, studying the mass rallies, and documenting how ordinary citizens could be transformed into willing participants in genocide. Jung saw that Hitler himself wasn't particularly charismatic or intelligent, but he possessed something far more dangerous: complete certainty in his own righteousness, combined with an uncanny ability to make others feel special for following him. Jung's analysis of Nazi propaganda revealed a chilling pattern. The most effective manipulators weren't those who appeared obviously evil, but those who presented themselves as saviors, as the only ones capable of leading humanity out of darkness. They spoke with absolute conviction about complex issues, never entertaining the possibility that they might be wrong. They created an intoxicating sense of belonging for their followers, while systematically dehumanizing anyone who questioned their vision. But Jung's most disturbing discovery came when he realized this wasn't about politics or ideology. It was about a fundamental psychological pattern that could appear anywhere, in any culture at any time. He observed the same trait in cult leaders who convinced followers to abandon their families, in corporate executives who destroyed companies while enriching themselves, and in seemingly ordinary individuals who gradually gained control over their social circles through manipulation and emotional abuse. What made Jung's insights particularly credible was his willingness to turn the same analytical lens on himself. He documented his own struggles with what he called inflation, moments when he felt possessed by grandiose ideas about his importance or special knowledge. This brutal self-honesty allowed him to map the territory of dangerous psychology from the inside, understanding not just how others fell into this trap, but how seductive it could be for anyone. Jung's clinical notes from this period reveal his growing alarm at what he was discovering. The dangerous trait he was tracking wasn't a rare disorder confined to obvious villains. It was a potential that existed in every human being, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. More troubling still, Jung observed that certain cultural and technological developments were creating those perfect conditions on a mass scale. His most chilling observation was this: the trait that posed the greatest danger to humanity wasn't found in the obviously disturbed, but in those who appeared most confident, most certain, most convinced of their own virtue. These individuals didn't see themselves as dangerous. They saw themselves as humanity's salvation, and this realization led Jung to a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If this psychological pattern had appeared consistently throughout history, always with devastating results, what would happen when it emerged in an age of global communication and unprecedented technological power? When Jung began tracing this psychological pattern through history, what he discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. The dangerous trait he had identified wasn't an anomaly. It was a recurring theme in human civilization, appearing with clockwork regularity whenever certain conditions aligned. Like a psychological virus, it would lie dormant for years, then suddenly emerge to devastate entire societies before burning itself out, only to reappear in a new form decades later. Consider the Salem witch trials of 1692. At the center of the hysteria weren't obviously deranged individuals, but respected community members who spoke with absolute moral certainty about the presence of evil in their midst. They couldn't be reasoned with because they had moved beyond reason into a realm of pure conviction. They saw themselves as righteous warriors against darkness, and anyone who questioned their methods was clearly in league with the devil. The pattern Jung identified was clear: initial moral certainty, gradual expansion of accusations, systematic silencing of dissent, and ultimately, the destruction of the very community they claimed to be protecting. Fast forward to the French Revolution's reign of terror. Robespierre and his followers didn't see themselves as bloodthirsty monsters. They were the champions of virtue, purifying society of corruption. They spoke with unwavering confidence about who deserved to live and who deserved to die. They created elaborate justifications for their actions, complete moral systems that made mass execution not just acceptable, but morally necessary. The dangerous trait Jung had identified was there again: the complete absence of self-doubt, coupled with an insatiable need to impose one's vision on others. But Jung's analysis went deeper than just identifying historical examples. He mapped the progression that this psychological pattern always followed, regardless of the culture or era in which it appeared. It began with what he called inflation, an individual becoming possessed by an archetypal image of themselves as a savior, a revolutionary, or a visionary. This inflation made them magnetic to others who were searching for meaning and direction. The second phase involved the gradual accumulation of followers who projected their own need for certainty onto the inflated individual. These weren't weak-minded people. Often they were intelligent, educated individuals who had become exhausted by uncertainty and complexity. They found relief in surrendering their own judgment to someone who seemed to have all the answers. The third phase was perhaps the most insidious, the systematic redefinition of reality itself. The inflated individual and their followers would create an alternative version of truth that couldn't be challenged from the outside because it was internally consistent and emotionally satisfying. Anyone who questioned this alternative reality wasn't just wrong, they were evil, corrupt, or part of the problem that needed to be eliminated. Jung observed this pattern in Stalin's purges, where the Soviet leader convinced an entire nation that hidden enemies were everywhere. That constant vigilance was necessary, and that he alone could be trusted to identify and eliminate threats. The same pattern appeared in Mao's Cultural Revolution, where young people were convinced they were purifying Chinese society by destroying its traditional culture and persecuting intellectuals. What made Jung's analysis particularly chilling was his recognition that this pattern wasn't limited to political movements. He saw it in religious cults, where charismatic leaders convinced followers to abandon their families and surrender their possessions. He saw it in corporate environments, where executives created cultures of fear and loyalty while systematically looting their companies. He saw it in smaller social groups, where one individual gradually gained psychological control over others through alternating charm and criticism. The corporate world provided some of Jung's most illuminating case studies. He analyzed executives who spoke with absolute confidence about market conditions they couldn't possibly predict, who created elaborate justifications for decisions that served only their own interests, and who surrounded themselves with yes-men while systematically eliminating anyone who might challenge their vision. These individuals weren't psychopaths. In the clinical sense, they genuinely believed in their own righteousness and often convinced themselves that their success proved their superiority. Jung's study of cult leaders revealed another disturbing aspect of this pattern. These individuals often began with genuine spiritual or social insights, but gradually became intoxicated by their own authority. They stopped learning, stopped questioning themselves, and began to see any criticism as persecution. They created closed systems where they were the sole source of truth, and where loyalty to them became more important than objective reality. Perhaps most troubling of all, Jung noticed that this dangerous psychological pattern was becoming more frequent and more powerful in the modern era. The mass media, he observed, could amplify the influence of inflated individuals far beyond anything seen in previous centuries. A single person with this trait could now reach millions of people simultaneously, creating mass movements with unprecedented speed and scope. But Jung's historical analysis revealed one consistent truth: this pattern always ended the same way. The inflated individual would eventually overreach. Their alternative reality would collide with objective facts, and the entire structure would collapse, but not before causing enormous damage to everyone involved. The question that haunted Jung was whether humanity would learn to recognize this pattern before it was too late, or whether we were doomed to repeat it endlessly, with ever-increasing destructive potential. As Jung documented case after case, pattern after pattern, he began to realize that he wasn't just studying history, he was looking at a preview of humanity's future. And what he saw terrified him. After decades of clinical observation and historical analysis, Jung finally articulated what he had discovered. The most dangerous trait in human psychology wasn't violence, wasn't hatred, wasn't even traditional mental illness. It was something far more subtle and infinitely more destructive: the complete fusion of ego with an archetypal image, creating what Jung termed psychological inflation, combined with what he called shadow projection. When someone becomes psychologically inflated, they don't just have confidence, they become possessed by an idealized image of themselves as a hero, savior, visionary, or revolutionary. This isn't mere arrogance or narcissism, though it shares some characteristics with both. This is a complete loss of psychological boundaries, where the individual can no longer distinguish between their personal desires and cosmic truth, between their opinions and universal law. Jung observed that this inflation typically begins with a genuine insight or talent. A person might have real leadership abilities, a valid criticism of society, or a useful idea. But instead of holding this insight lightly, as one perspective among many, they become identified with it completely. They stop being a person who has an idea and become the living embodiment of that idea. Their ego inflates to cosmic proportions, and they begin to see themselves as uniquely qualified to judge, guide, or save others. What makes this psychological state so dangerous is that it feels incredible to the person experiencing it. Jung described it as a kind of intoxication. The individual feels more alive, more purposeful, more important than ever before. They experience what seems like enhanced clarity about complex issues, unwavering conviction about right and wrong, and a sense of mission that gives their life ultimate meaning. It's no wonder that people become addicted to this state and will do almost anything to maintain it. But there's a dark side to this inflation that Jung considered even more dangerous: the complete projection of the shadow. Everyone has what Jung called a shadow, the aspects of their personality that they find unacceptable and try to hide or deny. In healthy individuals, this shadow remains somewhat conscious, acknowledged if not fully integrated. They know they're capable of selfishness, cruelty, or error, and this knowledge keeps them humble and empathetic. However, when someone becomes psychologically inflated, they can no longer tolerate any awareness of their own darkness. Their idealized self-image is so important to them that they must project all their negative qualities onto others. They become incapable of seeing their own selfishness, so everyone who opposes them becomes selfish. They cannot acknowledge their own capacity for cruelty, so anyone who criticizes them becomes cruel. They refuse to admit their own errors, so anyone who points out their mistakes becomes dishonest or corrupt. This shadow projection creates what Jung called a paranoid system, a worldview where the inflated individual is surrounded by enemies who possess all the negative qualities they refuse to see in themselves. These aren't random enemies. They're specifically the people who threaten the inflated person's grandiose self-image by questioning their judgment, challenging their authority, or simply refusing to validate their inflation. Jung's clinical notes reveal how this psychological mechanism operates in practice. The inflated individual begins to see patterns of persecution everywhere. Criticism becomes evidence of a conspiracy. Disagreement becomes proof of moral corruption. Independent thinking becomes a sign of disloyalty or mental illness. The inflated person's worldview becomes increasingly paranoid and adversarial, but from their perspective, they're simply responding rationally to the genuine threats surrounding them. What makes this psychological pattern particularly insidious is its self-reinforcing nature. The more the person projects their shadow onto others, the more justified their inflation feels. If everyone around them is corrupt, selfish, or evil, then of course they need to take control. If no one else can be trusted, then obviously they must make all the important decisions. If the world is full of enemies, then naturally, they need to gather loyal followers who will help them fight the good fight. Jung observed that people in this psychological state become master manipulators, not through conscious calculation, but through unconscious psychological mechanisms. They develop an uncanny ability to identify others' insecurities and vulnerabilities, then offer themselves as the solution. They alternate between grandiose promises and subtle threats, between effusive praise for loyalty and devastating criticism for independence. They create what Jung called psychological dependency in their followers, a state where others become addicted to the inflated person's approval and terrified of their disapproval. Modern psychological research has validated many of Jung's observations. Through studies of narcissistic personality disorder, authoritarian personality types, and cult dynamics, Researchers have identified what they call malignant narcissism, a combination of narcissistic grandiosity, antisocial behavior, paranoid ideation, and sadistic aggression that closely matches Jung's description of psychological inflation, combined with shadow projection. But Jung's insight went beyond individual pathology. He recognized that this dangerous psychological pattern could spread through groups, organizations, and even entire societies. When enough people become infected with the same inflation, projecting their shadows onto the same targets, the result is what Jung called mass psychosis, entire populations becoming possessed by archetypal images of themselves as righteous warriors. Against evil enemies, Jung's most terrifying realization was that modern technology and mass media were creating ideal conditions for this psychological virus to spread. Social media algorithms, he would have observed, are perfectly designed to feed psychological inflation by providing constant validation for existing beliefs while filtering out challenging perspectives. The result is not just individual inflation, but collective inflation on a scale never before seen in human history. The question Jung left us with is both simple and profound. How do we recognize this dangerous psychological pattern in others and, more importantly, in ourselves before it's too late? If Jung were alive today, he would be both fascinated and horrified by how perfectly our digital age has amplified the psychological pattern he identified. Social media platforms, with their endless feedback loops of likes, shares, and comments, have created what can only be described as inflation factories, systems specifically designed to reward the very psychological traits Jung considered most dangerous. Consider the anatomy of a viral post. It's rarely nuanced, rarely acknowledges complexity or uncertainty. Instead, it speaks with absolute conviction about controversial topics, presents complex issues in simple terms, and offers the reader a chance to feel morally superior by agreeing and sharing. The algorithm rewards this kind of content because it generates engagement, but what it's really doing is feeding psychological inflation on a massive scale. The modern influencer economy has institutionalized Jung's dangerous pattern. Successful social media personalities learn, consciously or unconsciously, to project unwavering confidence about topics they may know little about. They speak with authority about politics, psychology, relationships, and life philosophy, building massive followings by offering simple answers to complex questions. The most successful aren't necessarily the most knowledgeable. They're the most inflated, the most certain, the most willing to project their shadows onto convenient targets. Political discourse has become a particularly potent breeding ground for Jung's dangerous trait. Politicians who acknowledge complexity, admit uncertainty, or show genuine humility are quickly overwhelmed by those who offer simple solutions and absolute certainty. The modern political landscape rewards inflation while punishing the kind of self-reflection and intellectual honesty that Jung considered essential for psychological health. But the most insidious aspect of our current moment is how Jung's dangerous pattern has infiltrated everyday relationships and workplace dynamics. The same psychological mechanisms that create dictators and cult leaders now operate in corporate boardrooms, online communities, and even family systems. People learn to weaponize certainty, to use moral indignation as a tool for gaining control, and to systematically silence dissent by labeling it as harmful or offensive. Jung would have been particularly struck by cancel culture, not as a political phenomenon, but as a psychological one. The pattern is unmistakable. Individuals or groups become inflated with moral certainty, identify targets onto whom they can project their shadows, then mobilize collective action to destroy those targets while maintaining their own sense of righteousness. The psychological satisfaction this provides to participants is exactly what Jung observed in his studies of mass movements and mob psychology. Corporate culture has become another arena where Jung's dangerous trait flourishes. CEOs and executives who exhibit extreme confidence, never admit mistakes, and systematically eliminate dissenting voices are often rewarded with higher positions and greater influence. The modern emphasis on visionary leadership often rewards exactly the kind of psychological inflation that Jung identified as most dangerous. These leaders create cultures of fear disguised as cultures of excellence, where questioning the leader's vision becomes tantamount to betrayal. The dating world has also been transformed by these dynamics. Dating apps reward profiles that project absolute confidence and success, while algorithms match people based on shared certainties rather than complementary qualities. The result is relationships built on mutual inflation rather than genuine intimacy, where partners validate each other's certainties rather than challenging each other to grow. Jung would have been particularly concerned about how these digital systems affect young people whose personalities are still forming. Adolescents who once would have learned humility through face-to-face social interaction now receive constant validation for their most extreme views. They learn to perform certainty rather than develop genuine wisdom, to seek followers rather than friends, and to measure their worth through external metrics rather than internal development. The mental health implications are staggering. Anxiety and depression rates have skyrocketed, not just because of social media comparison, but because of the psychological exhaustion that comes from maintaining inflated personas. Young people report feeling unable to admit uncertainty, ask for help or show vulnerability, all the qualities Jung considered essential for psychological health. Perhaps most troubling is how our information ecosystem has created what Jung would recognize as collective paranoid systems. Different groups develop their own alternative realities, each convinced that they're surrounded by enemies who possess all the negative qualities they refuse to see in themselves. These aren't just different political opinions. They're completely different versions of reality, each maintained by the same psychological mechanisms Jung observed in individual pathology. The speed and scale of modern communication mean that Jung's dangerous psychological pattern can now spread globally within hours. A single inflated individual can reach millions of people simultaneously, creating instant mass movements based on shared inflation and shadow projection. The result is not just individual psychological dysfunction, but collective madness on a scale never before seen in human history. But Jung's insights also offer hope. If we can learn to recognize these patterns, if we can develop what he called psychological consciousness, we might be able to create digital systems and social structures that reward humility rather than inflation, complexity rather than certainty, and genuine dialogue rather than echo chamber reinforcement. The question is whether we'll develop this consciousness before the psychological virus Jung identified consumes what remains of our capacity for rational discourse and genuine human connection. Jung didn't leave us defenseless against this psychological plague. Through decades of clinical observation, he developed what we might call a recognition protocol, a systematic approach to identifying dangerous psychological inflation in others and, more crucially, in ourselves. This isn't about amateur diagnosis or psychological profiling. It's about developing the kind of consciousness that can protect us from manipulation and prevent us from becoming manipulators ourselves. The first warning sign Jung identified is what he called the absence of doubt. Healthy individuals maintain what Jung termed psychological porosity. They remain open to new information, acknowledge the limits of their knowledge, and hold their beliefs lightly enough to change them when presented with compelling evidence. The psychologically inflated individual, by contrast, exhibits what Jung called premature closure. They reach conclusions quickly and then defend them as if their life depends on it. Watch for people who never say, "I don't." No, who never acknowledge complexity or nuance, who respond to challenging questions not with curiosity but with irritation or attack. These individuals haven't just developed strong opinions, they've become identified with their opinions so completely that questioning the opinion feels like questioning their very existence. The second warning sign is what Jung called shadow immunity, the complete inability to acknowledge negative qualities in oneself. Everyone has flaws, makes mistakes, and harbors selfish impulses. Psychologically healthy individuals can admit these shadow aspects with appropriate humility. But inflated individuals seem incapable of genuine self-criticism. They either deny their flaws entirely or transform them into virtues through elaborate rationalization. Listen for people who never genuinely apologize, who always have excuses for their failures, who seem incapable of laughing at themselves. Pay attention to how they respond when confronted with their mistakes. Do they show curiosity about their blind spots, or do they become defensive and attack the messenger? The third sign is what Jung termed empathy failure. As individuals become more inflated, they gradually lose the ability to genuinely understand perspectives different from their own. They might perform empathy, saying the right words or making the appropriate gestures, but they can't actually feel what it's like to see the world through someone else's eyes. This isn't because they're inherently cruel, but because their inflation makes them the center of their own universe. Observe how people respond to genuine disagreement. Do they show curiosity about why someone might think differently? Do they ask questions designed to understand? Or do they ask questions designed to trap and humiliate? Can they accurately summarize opposing viewpoints before critiquing them? Or do they only engage with strawman versions of ideas they disagree with? Jung also identified what he called loyalty testing, the tendency for inflated individuals to constantly test whether others are sufficiently devoted to them and their vision. These tests start subtly, but become increasingly demanding over time. The person might ask followers to defend increasingly indefensible positions, to cut ties with people who question the leader, or to make sacrifices that serve no purpose other than proving loyalty. Be wary of people who seem to need constant validation, who interpret neutral behavior as betrayal, and who cannot tolerate independent thinking in their circle. Notice whether someone's approval comes with strings attached, whether they withdraw affection when you disagree with them or make decisions they don't like. But Jung's most important insight was that we must apply this same recognition protocol to ourselves. The psychological mechanisms that create dangerous inflation operate in all of us, and the only protection is ruthless self-honesty. Jung recommended what he called active imagination, a practice of regularly examining our own motivations, acknowledging our shadows, and maintaining what he termed creative doubt about our own certainties. Ask yourself, when was the last time you genuinely changed your mind about something important? When did you last admit you were wrong about something significant? Can you think of areas where you might be deceiving yourself? Do you surround yourself with people who challenge you, or do you gravitate toward those who validate your existing beliefs? Jung suggested developing what he called psychological humility, not self-deprecation or false modesty, but genuine recognition of the limits of our knowledge and the fallibility of our judgment. This doesn't mean becoming paralyzed by uncertainty, but rather holding our convictions lightly enough that we can revise them when necessary. The practice Jung recommended most strongly was what he called shadow work, actively seeking out and acknowledging the negative, qualities we prefer to ignore in ourselves. This isn't about self-flagellation, but about maintaining psychological wholeness by integrating rather than projecting our darkness. Jung believed that individuals who practiced these disciplines could not only protect themselves from manipulation, but could serve as psychological immune systems in their communities, people who could recognize and resist collective inflation before it reached dangerous levels. The ultimate test Jung proposed was simple but profound. Can you disagree with someone while still seeing their humanity? Can you hold strong convictions while maintaining genuine curiosity about alternative perspectives? Can you lead others without needing to control them? Can you be wrong about something important without feeling like your entire identity is threatened? These aren't just psychological exercises. Jung believed they were essential survival skills for navigating an increasingly complex and connected world where the consequences of collective psychological inflation could be catastrophic. Jung's individual psychological insights take on terrifying significance when we consider their collective implications. We are living through what Jung would have recognized as a perfect storm, conditions that make mass psychological inflation not just possible, but almost inevitable. The question is no longer whether dangerous psychological patterns will emerge in our society, but whether we'll recognize them quickly enough to prevent catastrophic damage. Jung observed that certain social conditions create fertile ground for the spread of psychological inflation, rapid technological change that outpaces human adaptation, economic uncertainty that makes people desperate for simple solutions, social fragmentation that leaves individuals searching for belonging. and information systems that reward certainty over accuracy. Our current moment exhibits all of these characteristics simultaneously, creating what Jung would have called a collective neurosis of unprecedented scale. The proliferation of inflated individuals in positions of influence creates a feedback loop that threatens the very foundations of democratic discourse. When leaders, influencers, and authority figures model psychological inflation, they normalize it throughout society. People learn that success comes not from wisdom or competence, but from projecting unwavering confidence and never admitting error. The result is a race to the bottom, where the most inflated individuals rise to positions of greatest influence. Perhaps most dangerously, our technological systems have begun to exhibit the same characteristics as psychologically inflated individuals. Algorithms that determine what information we see operate with absolute certainty, never acknowledging the limitations of their data or the biases in their programming. They create filter bubbles that protect us from challenging information while feeding us content that confirms our existing beliefs. In essence, we've created artificial intelligence systems that exhibit the very psychological traits Jung identified as most dangerous in humans. The economic implications are equally troubling. Financial markets increasingly reward companies led by inflated executives who promise impossible returns and never acknowledge risk. Investors flock to leaders who project absolute confidence, even when that confidence is completely detached from reality. We've created economic systems that systematically reward the psychological traits that lead to spectacular crashes and widespread suffering. But Jung's analysis also points towards solutions. He believed that psychological consciousness, the ability to recognize these patterns in ourselves and others, could serve as a kind of collective immune system. If enough people develop what he called discrimination consciousness, they can resist manipulation and prevent dangerous individuals from gaining power. This requires more than individual awareness. It demands what Jung called cultural transformation. We need to create social and technological systems that reward psychological health rather than inflation. Educational institutions must teach not just critical thinking, but what Jung called psychological thinking, the ability to recognize and resist unconscious psychological manipulation. Media systems need to be redesigned to reward nuance over certainty, complexity over simplicity, and genuine dialogue over performative conflict. Social media algorithms should promote content that acknowledges uncertainty and presents multiple perspectives, rather than rewarding the kind of absolute certainty that feeds psychological inflation. Most importantly, we need to cultivate what Jung called the courage of imperfection, the willingness to admit when we're wrong, to acknowledge the limits of our knowledge, and to remain curious about perspectives that challenge our worldview. This isn't about becoming wishy-washy or losing our convictions. It's about holding our beliefs with what Jung called conscious grip, rather than unconscious possession. Jung's ultimate message was both warning and hope. The psychological trait he identified as most dangerous, the complete fusion of ego with archetypal image, represents humanity's greatest threat to itself. But consciousness of this threat is also our greatest protection. When we can recognize psychological inflation in ourselves and others, when we can maintain what Jung called creative doubt about our own certainties, and when we can build social systems that reward wisdom over inflation, we can create what Jung envisioned as conscious civilization. The choice before us is clear. We can continue to reward and amplify the psychological traits that have led to every major human catastrophe in history, or we can develop the consciousness necessary to recognize and resist these patterns before they consume us. As Jung wrote in his final works, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. But perhaps equally terrifying, and equally necessary, is to accept that the greatest threat to our survival lies not in external enemies, but in our own capacity for self-deception. Jung's warning echoes across the decades with increasing urgency. The world hangs on a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. Whether that thread holds or breaks may depend on whether we heed his call to develop the psychological consciousness necessary to navigate the dangerous waters ahead. The most dangerous sign in a person isn't hatred or violence, it's the absolute certainty that they're right and everyone else is wrong. And the only antidote is the courage to question our own certainties while we still can. The time for comfortable delusions has passed. Jung's message is clear. Stay alert, develop consciousness, and remember that the enemy we must fear most is the one that looks back at us from the mirror, convinced of its own righteousness and incapable of doubt.